Houston, October 2001. The air conditioning in the Enron building is humming. A low industrial drone that vibrates through the soles of expensive leather shoes. It is late. The fluorescent lights reflect off polished mahogany tables, but the dominant sound echoing through the basement is not the clicking of keyboards calculating record profits. It is the rhythmic, mechanical crunch of industrial shredders. Thousands of pages of financial documents, internal emails, and highly sensitive audit trails are being turned into microscopic paper confetti. You are looking at the exact moment the greatest illusion in modern financial history is being dismantled by the very people paid to verify it. The men in the basement running those shredders work for Arthur Andersen, one of the 5 largest and most respected accounting firms on the planet. They are supposed to be the objective watchdogs, the neutral police of the free market. But tonight, they are destroying the evidence. This is not just a story about a rogue energy company hiding debt. This is the story of the fundamental paradox at the very heart of the global economy. A system where the referee is paid millions of dollars by the winning team. The firms that replaced Arthur Andersen, known today as the Big Four, sit at the absolute choke point of global trust. They sign off on the numbers that dictate your pension, your stock portfolio, and the stability of the global markets. But the underlying flaw that caused the shredders to run in Houston was never fixed. It was simply upgraded, packaged, and sold to the rest of the corporate world. To understand how deeply this conflict is baked into the system, you have to sit in the boardroom where the real negotiations happen. Imagine a private meeting between an Enron executive and an Arthur Andersen audit partner. The executive slides a complex schematic of off-balance sheet entities across the table. "We need to move this massive pile of debt off our main books," the executive says, tapping the paper. "If the public sees this debt, our stock tanks, and we cannot pay you your $25 million consulting fee for next year." The audit partner looks at the schematic. As an auditor, his job is to flag this as deceptive. But as a partner in a firm that also sells consulting services to this exact same client, his job is to keep the executive happy. "Well," the partner replies carefully, "if we structure it exactly like this, using these specific special purpose vehicles, we can technically classify it in a way that keeps it off the main ledger. It is a grey area, but we will sign off on it." This is the exact moment the watchdog becomes the accomplice. The auditor is no longer independently verifying the math. They are actively helping the client design the very loopholes they are supposed to be policing. Before we tear down exactly how this shadow monopoly rebuilt itself after Enron, hit subscribe to Capital Curriculum. Join the few who actually understand the hidden mechanisms of the financial system, rather than just reading the sanitized press releases. The shredders in Houston were supposed to be a wake-up call for regulators. Instead, they served as a blueprint for an entirely new kind of corporate empire. The structural flaw here is remarkably simple, yet it forms the bedrock of a multi-billion-dollar industry. It is the conflict of the paid police. Imagine a city where the police department is entirely funded by the local mafia. The mafia pays the officers' salaries, buys their squad cars, and dictates their promotions. When a crime occurs, the police are technically required to investigate, but if they actually arrest the mob boss, their entire funding stream vanishes overnight. In the financial world, auditors are hired and paid directly by the companies they audit. The management team decides which auditing firm gets the contract, and more importantly, they decide if that contract gets renewed. The mechanism relies on a subtle psychological and financial pressure. An audit partner at a major firm knows that landing a massive Fortune 500 client is the pinnacle of their career. Losing that client because you refuse to sign off on their aggressive accounting choices is a career death sentence. You do not get promoted for being a whistleblower against your own revenue source. You get promoted for client retention. This creates a massive incentive to prioritize a smooth relationship over aggressive skepticism. The math is undeniable. You cannot be an objective enforcer of the law when your paycheck, your bonus, and your prestige are entirely dependent on the goodwill of the people you are supposed to be investigating. The Arthur Andersen collapse proved that when consulting fees dwarf audit fees, the audit simply becomes a rubber stamp used to keep the consulting money flowing. The client buys the stamp, and the market blindly trusts the paperwork. When the Enron scandal finally detonated, the fallout was catastrophic. Arthur Andersen, one of the foundational pillars of global finance, was criminally indicted and effectively erased from existence. Tens of thousands of innocent employees lost their jobs, and the firm was reduced to a cautionary tale. Regulators marched before the cameras, promising the public that the era of corrupted audits was over. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act was passed, hailed as the ultimate shield for investors. But the destruction of Arthur Andersen did not fix the mafia-funded police department. It simply reduced the number of precincts. Before Enron, there was the Big Five. After Enron, the remaining massive multinational clients did not suddenly stop needing audits. They simply migrated their business to the surviving firms: Deloitte, PwC, EY, and KPMG. The Big Four were born not out of reform, but out of concentration. Instead of creating a more competitive, transparent market, the collapse of Andersen created an oligopoly with unprecedented, concentrated power. The surviving four absorbed the talent, the clients, and the exact same conflict-laden business models. The warning of Enron was completely misunderstood. The public thought the problem was one bad accounting firm. The reality was that the entire underlying incentive structure was fundamentally broken. The Big Four now had a near total monopoly on the world's most lucrative financial choke points. And with that monopoly came a terrifying new realization. They were no longer just auditing the system. They were becoming too big for the system to ever hold accountable again. The stage was set for an era of unchecked dominance. London, late 2008. The financial capital of Europe feels like a crime scene. The dust from the subprime mortgage collapse is still settling over the square mile. Investment banks like Lehman Brothers have vanished into thin air, leaving behind empty trading floors and thousands of cardboard boxes. Trillions of dollars in wealth have been vaporized. Yet, amidst the smoking ruins of the global banking system, four distinct corporate logos remain brightly illuminated on the skyline: Deloitte, PwC, EY, KPMG. While the banks they audited required massive taxpayer bailouts to survive their own toxic balance sheets, the auditors themselves emerged virtually unscathed. The Big Four did not just survive the financial crisis, they thrived in the aftermath. As regulators demanded more compliance, more stress tests, and more risk assessments, the Big Four were waiting with open arms to sell the solution to the very problems they had failed to predict. The scene inside their glass-walled partner offices was not one of panic, but of aggressive expansion. They realized that their brand names were perceived as the ultimate stamp of safety in a terrified market. The crisis proved that the world desperately needed the illusion of certainty, and the Big Four held the exclusive rights to print it. They began to aggressively scale up, building massive advisory arms to compete directly with elite consulting firms like McKinsey. They were no longer just accountants hunched over ledgers. They were transforming into vast, global professional services networks, armed with a business model designed to monetize every single phase of a corporate life cycle, from the initial audit to the ultimate liquidation. Imagine a pitch meeting inside a sleek London boardroom shortly after the crash. A senior partner from a Big Four firm sits across from the CEO of a struggling multinational bank. The partner isn't there just to discuss the annual audit. He is there to deploy the dual threat model. "We are happy to sign off on your statutory audit for $3 million, the partner begins, sliding a glossy proposal across the table. But, looking at your books, your regulatory risk is massive. For an additional $15 million, our specialised risk advisory team can rebuild your entire compliance framework. The CEO squints at the proposal. Wait, you want to audit our financial controls and simultaneously be the consultants we hire to design those exact same controls? The partner smiles, a practiced expression of corporate reassurance. We call it an integrated service offering. Because we already know your systems inside and out from the audit, we are uniquely positioned to provide the consulting. It is efficient. The CEO understands the subtext perfectly. If he hires the audit firm for the massive consulting gig, the audit team is going to be far less likely to cause a public scene about any financial discrepancies. The audit becomes the key that unlocks the vault for the much more lucrative advisory work. The watchdog is officially offering to install the alarm system, patrol the grounds, and grade its own performance, all on the same invoice. This dialogue is the silent soundtrack of modern corporate governance. A perfectly legal extortion where the price of a clean bill of health is a massive consulting retainer. The mechanism at play here is known as the loss leader strategy, weaponized on a macroeconomic scale. In retail, a loss leader is when a store sells milk at a heavy discount to get you inside, knowing you will buy high-margin items like cereal and coffee once you are there. For the Big Four, the statutory audit became the milk. It is a highly regulated, commoditized service with intense downward pressure on fees. You cannot easily scale an audit to infinity. But consulting services, tax optimization, mergers and acquisitions advisory, and cybersecurity consulting have virtually no ceiling. The firm uses the prestige and mandatory nature of the audit relationship to plant its flag inside the target company. Once the firm is embedded, the real monetization begins. The mechanism relies on a concept called the halo effect. Because the audit firm is perceived as independent and rigorously analytical, the client assumes their consulting advice is equally bulletproof. But the internal incentives are entirely warped. An auditor who spots a minor inefficiency in the supply chain is encouraged to quietly flag it to the advisory partners, who then swoop in to pitch a multi-million-dollar supply chain transformation project. The core function of checking the math is completely subordinated to the mandate of cross-selling. You don't build a $200 billion empire by just checking receipts. You build it by creating an environment where the client feels utterly dependent on your network for every major strategic decision. The audit is merely the Trojan Horse used to breach the corporate walls. As the post-crisis decade rolled on, the revenue streams of the Big Four quietly but dramatically inverted. Statista data and industry breakdowns revealed a staggering shift. The firms were no longer primarily auditing companies. The vast majority of their explosive growth and the bulk of their actual revenue was now coming from non-audit advisory work. The tail was officially wagging the dog. The independent watchdog had become a high-powered corporate consigliere, whispering strategic advice into the ears of the very executives they were mandated to police. This revenue inversion created a toxic internal culture. Partners who sold massive consulting deals were celebrated as rainmakers, pulling down enormous bonuses and rising to the top of the firm's hierarchy. Partners who ran strict, combative audits that alienated clients were quietly marginalised. The corporate DNA of the Big Four mutated. But out in the public markets, the facade of total independence remained perfectly intact. Regulators continued to blindly rely on the Big Four's signatures to validate the health of the global economy. By 2015, the trap was fully set. The firms had grown so massive and their service lines so hopelessly intertwined with the world's largest corporations that extracting the auditor from the consultant became physically impossible. They had built an inescapable web of dependencies. But a monopoly built on a foundation of inherent conflicts cannot remain stable forever. The sheer weight of the advisory revenue was about to crack the bedrock of their audit quality, leading to a series of devastating, high-profile implosions that would expose the rot hiding behind the prestigious logos. New York, 2015. Imagine looking down from a helicopter at the towering skyscrapers of Manhattan. If you could colour-code the buildings based on which accounting firm audits the corporations inside them, the entire island would be painted in just 4 colours. This is the visual reality of the golden age of the shadow monopoly. The numbers are almost difficult to process. In the United States, the Big Four audit over 80% of all public companies by audit fees, and a staggering 88% of large accelerated filers, the massive juggernauts that drive the S&P 500. Across the Atlantic, the concentration is even more suffocating. The UK Financial Reporting Council reported that the Big Four earned 98% of FTSE 350 audit fees. 98%. That leaves a microscopic 2% scraps for every other accounting firm in existence. They do not just dominate the market, they are the market. Inside these skyscrapers, armies of junior associates in tailored suits work 90-hour weeks, utilising proprietary software platforms that cost billions to develop. The Big Four have constructed a barrier to entry so high that it touches the stratosphere. No mid-tier accounting firm has the global footprint, the specialised legal armies, or the technological infrastructure to audit a multinational tech giant with operations in 90 countries. The regulators know this. The banks know this. The corporate boards know this. The Big Four have successfully convinced the entire financial ecosystem that they are the only 4 adults in the room capable of handling the math of modern capitalism. To see the monopoly in action, listen to a hypothetical meeting of a Fortune 500 audit committee. The chairman sits at the head of the table, frustrated by rising audit fees. "We have been with PwC for 15 years, he says. Their fees are up 20%. I want to put the audit out to tender. Let us get some competitive bids." The chief financial officer sighs and opens a thick binder. "We cannot switch to Deloitte," the CFO explains. "They are currently running our global tax restructuring, which violates auditor independence rules." "Fine," the chairman snaps. "What about EY?" "EY is deeply embedded in our multi-year cybersecurity overhaul," the CFO replies. "If we make them our auditor, we have to fire them from the cyber project, which will delay our platform launch by a year." "Okay, then KPMG," the chairman says, his patience wearing thin. KPMG just advised our biggest rival on a hostile takeover, and our legal team flagged a massive conflict of interest. The chairman stares at the wall. So out of the thousands of accounting firms in the world, we literally have 0 alternatives. We have to pay PwC whatever they ask. This dialogue illustrates the brilliant architecture of the Big Four's dominance. By aggressively expanding into every conceivable consulting niche, they effectively conflict themselves out of competing for audits. This creates an artificial scarcity. For a massive multinational, choosing an auditor isn't a free market decision. It is a process of elimination that almost always leads right back to the incumbent firm. The illusion of choice is the ultimate weapon of the oligopoly. The financial mechanism that cements this golden age is known as extreme switching costs. In most industries, if a vendor underperforms or overcharges, you fire them and hire a competitor. But changing a Big Four auditor is more like trying to perform a heart transplant while the patient is sprinting a marathon. Over the course of a decade-long relationship, the auditor's proprietary methodologies, software plugins, and data extraction tools become deeply interwoven with the client's internal IT systems. The auditors know the exact quirks of the company's legacy mainframes. They know which specific middle manager holds the keys to the Asian subsidiary's cash accounts. If a company decides to switch auditors, they have to pay millions of dollars and dedicate thousands of internal man-hours just to bring the new firm up to speed. Management hates doing this because it disrupts operations and creates a temporary window of intense, uncomfortable scrutiny as the new firm tries to prove its rigor. Therefore, the path of least resistance is always to retain the incumbent. This extreme friction breeds a dangerous, localized complacency. The audit team on the ground realizes that, short of a catastrophic criminal indictment, the client is never going to leave. The grueling, aggressive skepticism required to hunt for complex fraud degrades into a bureaucratic, tick-the-box mindset. The auditors stop looking for hidden bombs and start merely verifying that the management's paperwork is filed in the correct folders. The system relies on the threat of getting fired to enforce quality. But when firing the auditor is financially unfeasible, that threat completely evaporates. By 2017, the shadow monopoly was operating at peak efficiency. The Big Four were pulling in hundreds of billions of dollars in global revenue, dictating the terms of their engagements, and floating above the fractured landscape of international financial regulation. They had successfully insulated themselves from the forces of free market competition. But when an ecosystem has zero natural predators, weakness begins to fester from within. The tick-the-box mentality, combined with the desperate pressure to protect lucrative consulting relationships, created massive blind spots. Junior auditors, overworked and under-resourced, were relying almost entirely on documents provided by corporate management without independent verification. The firms were rubber-stamping balance sheets that were built on pure fiction. The facade of invincibility was glowing brightly, but deep inside, the global supply chains and complex financial derivatives, massive sinkholes were forming. The Big Four had built a machine designed to generate fees, not to detect fraud. And that machine was about to collide violently with reality. The first major fracture would not happen in a complex derivatives market in Wall Street. It would happen on dusty construction sites across the United Kingdom, where a massive infrastructure giant was quietly bleeding to death, all while its auditor handed out pristine bills of health. The collapse of Carillion was about to prove that a 98% market share doesn't mean you are competent. It just means there is no one else left to blame. The United Kingdom, January 2018. The bitter winter wind sweeps across half-finished hospital construction sites and frozen highway expansion projects. The heavy yellow cranes are motionless. Thousands of workers arrive for their morning shifts, only to find the gates padlocked and security guards shaking their heads. Carillion, a massive multinational facilities management and construction titan with billions in government contracts, has catastrophically collapsed overnight. It is one of the largest corporate failures in modern British history. But the most chilling detail isn't the scale of the debt. It is the paperwork. Just months before the company disintegrated under the weight of nearly £7 billion of liabilities, their auditor, KPMG, had signed off on the financial statements, effectively declaring the company a going concern. Carillion's executives were paying out massive dividends and collecting executive bonuses based on phantom profits that KPMG had officially verified. The scene inside the parliamentary inquiry weeks later is electric with outrage. Politicians wave the glossy KPMG audit reports like smoking guns. How does a massive construction firm evaporate into thin air, while the most sophisticated financial watchdogs on Earth insist everything is perfectly fine? The Carillion disaster was not a sudden lightning strike. It was a slow-motion train crash that the auditors watched happen from the front row, actively validating the speed of the train. It exposed the stark reality that the Big Four's signatures were not a guarantee of financial health, but merely a receipt for services rendered. The cracks in the shadow monopoly were suddenly visible to the naked eye. To comprehend the failure at Carillion, you have to imagine the dialogue inside the audit room as the numbers started going sour. A KPMG audit partner sits with Carillion's finance director, reviewing a massively delayed hospital project that is bleeding cash. "We are hundreds of millions over budget on this build," the auditor notes, pointing to a red ledger. "Standard accounting rules dictate we need to recognise these losses immediately. We have to write down the value of this contract." The finance director leans in, his voice hard. "If you force us to recognise those losses today, we breach our banking covenants. The banks pull our funding, the company collapses, and you lose one of your biggest clients in the UK. Instead, we are going to assume that the government will eventually reimburse us for these overruns. Classify the projected reimbursement as current revenue." The auditor stares at the spreadsheet. He knows the government hasn't agreed to pay a dime. The revenue is entirely hypothetical. But challenging the board means sparking a crisis that could cost him his partnership. "All right," the auditor says quietly. "If management provides a written assumption that the claims will be successful, we can sign off on it." This is the devastating compromise. The auditor abdicates their role as an independent investigator and becomes a mere scribe, perfectly willing to record management's delusions as long as the paperwork is formatted correctly. The audit doesn't prevent the fraud, it institutionalizes it. They were actively pulling future imaginary profits into the present just to keep the corpse walking for one more fiscal quarter. The mechanism that allows these catastrophic misjudgments to occur without destroying the audit firm is a concept called diffused accountability. When Arthur Andersen collapsed, it was a single, unified partnership. The contagion killed the entire host. The modern Big Four are structured differently. They are not single global corporations. They are vast networks of locally owned franchises that merely share a brand name, software, and marketing budgets. KPMG UK is a separate legal entity from KPMG US. When Carillion collapsed, the resulting fines from the UK regulators were undeniably large, ultimately reaching tens of millions of pounds. But to a global network generating over $30 billion a year, a £20 million fine is not a deterrent. It is simply a parking ticket. It is the cost of doing business in a complex world. The financial structure of the Big Four effectively privatizes the massive gains of the consulting and audit fees, while socializing the catastrophic losses of an audit failure across the broader economy. If an individual audit partner screws up, they might be quietly asked to retire, but the firm itself faces zero existential threat. Regulators are terrified of issuing a fatal blow to a Big Four firm because reducing the oligopoly from 4 to 3 would completely destabilize the global financial system. The firms know they are too deeply embedded to be executed. This impenetrable armour of limited liability and systemic importance removes the ultimate biological fear of death from the corporate organism, breeding a culture of arrogant risk-taking. Following Carillion, the UK Financial Reporting Council issued blistering reports. They essentially declared that there was a systemic crisis in the sector. Academic studies on similar failures, like the Satyam scandal audited by PwC in India, reinforce the narrative. Reputational damage alone was no longer a sufficient mechanism to force the Big Four to do their jobs properly. The fines were paid, the press releases apologising for past shortcomings were issued, and the relentless machinery of cross-selling and partner distributions continued without a single skipped beat. The shadow monopoly absorbed the blow effortlessly. They convinced the politicians that Carillion was an isolated incident, a complex contracting failure, rather than an indictment of the audit model itself. But the ink on the Carillion post-mortems wasn't even dry before an infinitely more dangerous storm began brewing on the continent. While the British public was raging over construction debt, a sleek, futuristic financial technology giant in Germany was redefining the limits of corporate fraud. This wasn't a case of aggressive accounting on construction contracts. This was a case of pure, unadulterated fiction, involving billions of euros of completely imaginary cash. The auditor in charge was EY, and they were about to walk blindly into a scandal that would make Carillion look like a rounding error. The ultimate stress test for the Big Four's business model was waiting in Munich, and it was about to expose the terrifying incompetence at the very core of the oligopoly. Munich, June 2020. The glass and steel headquarters of Wirecard, the crown jewel of the European fintech revolution, is descending into absolute chaos. For years, Wirecard was the darling of the German stock exchange, a payment processor whose soaring valuation rivaled the continent's oldest banks. But today, the executive suites are a blur of panic. Private jets are being quietly chartered to non-extradition countries. The chief operating officer is literally packing a bag and vanishing into the wind. The reason for the panic is sitting on a desk in the auditing department. Wirecard has just been forced to admit to the global markets that 1.9 billion euros, a massive chunk of their entire corporate cash reserve, supposedly sitting safely in trust accounts in the Philippines, simply does not exist. It isn't temporarily tied up, it isn't locked in a complex derivative, it is a ghost. The money was never there. For nearly a decade, the auditing firm responsible for verifying Wirecard's financial reality was EY. Year after year, EY signed off on the pristine balance sheets, essentially telling the world that Wirecard was a fortress of cash. As investigative journalists and short sellers screamed from the rooftops that Wirecard was a massive, sophisticated Ponzi scheme, EY partners sat in Munich, rubber-stamping the illusion. The collapse of Wirecard isn't just a corporate bankruptcy. It is a profound humiliation for the German regulatory state and a devastating indictment of the auditing profession. The watchdog didn't just sleep through the burglary. They held the fleshlight for the thieves. To grasp the sheer absurdity of the Wirecard audit, picture the moment an EY auditor finally tries to locate the missing billions. The auditor sits in a cramped conference room with a senior Wirecard executive. We need independent confirmation of the 1.9 billion euros held in the Asian trust accounts, the auditor says, strictly following the textbook. We need to speak directly to the bank manager in Manila. The Wirecard executive smiles smoothly. Of course, but the time zone difference is tricky, and the bank's security protocols prevent direct external access. However, the trustee has provided these official bank statements. The executive slides a stack of PDFs across the table. The documents look suspiciously simple. The formatting is strange. Can we at least get original copies mailed from the branch? The auditor asks. No need, the executive replies, his tone sharpening. If you delay the audit sign-off over this, our stock will plummet. and our board will seriously reconsider our relationship with your firm. The auditor looks at the PDFs. Basic auditing standards demand that you never accept documents directly from management to verify cash balances. You must get them straight from the bank. But pushing back means sparking a nuclear conflict with a massive, prestigious client. The auditor swallows hard, takes the PDFs and signs the file. Looks good to me. They allowed the management team to dictate the terms of their own investigation. They accepted blatant forgeries because the psychological and financial friction of demanding the truth was simply too high for the partner to bear. The desire for a smooth client relationship overrode basic mathematical reality. The psychological mechanism that doomed EY in the Wirecard scandal is a documented phenomenon called motivated blindness. When your financial survival and career trajectory are directly tied to the success of your client, your brain unconsciously filters out red flags. You don't necessarily set out to commit fraud. Instead, you develop an overwhelming bias to trust management's explanations, no matter how convoluted or absurd they become. When a short seller publishes a 100-page dossier detailing exact instances of fraud at Wirecard, a truly independent auditor would tear the company's ledgers apart to find the truth. But an auditor captured by motivated blindness views the short seller as an enemy of the client. The auditor instinctively circles the wagons to protect the company paying their fees. Furthermore, the Big Four's internal staffing models actively contribute to this blindness. Audits are highly seasonal and notoriously understaffed. Teams of exhausted 25-year-old junior associates are sent into the field with impossibly tight deadlines. They do not have the time, the mandate, or the forensic expertise to unravel a globe-spanning collusive fraud ring. Their job is to fill out the pre-designed risk matrices and move on to the next file. The entire system is engineered for efficiency and margin, not for deep adversarial skepticism. Wirecard weaponized this structural weakness. They knew that as long as they provided the right-looking PDFs and maintained a veneer of aggressive corporate confidence, the exhausted, conflicted auditors would inevitably take the path of least resistance and sign the paper. When Wirecard filed for insolvency, billions of dollars of investor capital evaporated into thin air. The CEO was arrested, and international warrants were issued for the top executives. The German parliamentary inquiry into the scandal was brutal, explicitly calling out EY for years of unacceptable auditing practices. Regulators banned EY from taking on new major audit clients in Germany for 2 years. To the outside observer, it looked like the ultimate reckoning. Surely missing 1.9 billion euros of literal cash would be the kill shot that finally forced the structural breakup of the Big Four. But the shadow monopoly had already calculated the blast radius. EY's global leadership quickly ring-fenced the German unit, claiming the failure was the result of a highly sophisticated criminal conspiracy that even the most robust audit procedures may not uncover. They deployed armies of PR managers to spin the narrative. And the most terrifying part? It worked. Despite the massive fines and the catastrophic reputational damage, EY's global revenue continued to climb. The oligopoly held firm because the market simply had no alternative. Multinational corporations still needed their audits, and there were still only 4 firms on Earth large enough to provide them. Wirecard proved definitively that the Big Four are essentially bulletproof. They can miss one of the most blatant, multi-billion-dollar frauds of the 21st century and simply shrug it off as a localized operational hiccup. The realization sent a chill through the regulatory community. If Wirecard couldn't break the shadow monopoly, what possibly could? The answer lay hidden in the corridors of power, where the auditors were rewriting the rules of the game itself. Washington, D.C., present day. The harsh, unnatural light of a congressional hearing room reflects off the polished wood of the witness table. Dozens of cameras click furiously as senior executives from the Big Four take their seats. Behind the elevated dais, politicians lean into their microphones, their voices dripping with practiced, televised outrage. They cite the failures of Enron, Capitalism, and Wirecard. They slam their fists and demand accountability. They threaten to forcibly split the audit and advisory arms, destroying the conflict-laden business model once and for all. It looks like a high-stakes reckoning, but if you look closely at the body language of the Big Four executives, you do not see fear. You see polite, bored patience. They have sat through this exact theatre production a dozen times in a dozen different countries. They know that behind the closed doors of the committee rooms, their massive lobbying arms have already secured the exits. The scene in Washington is the final grand illusion of the shadow monopoly. The public is allowed to see the watchdogs get yelled at, which creates the comforting feeling that the government is in control. But the reality is that the regulatory state has been entirely captured. The Big Four spend millions deploying armies of former politicians and regulators to ensure that every proposed reform is watered down into meaningless bureaucratic checklists. They are no longer just reacting to regulations, they are actively writing the legislation that governs their own oversight. The hearing room isn't a courtroom, it is a stage play designed to distract you while the monopoly silently tightens its grip on the global economy. The true nature of this regulatory capture is best understood in the quiet conversations that happen at fundraising dinners after the hearings conclude. A top-tier Big Four lobbyist stands near the bar, speaking in low tones with the lead counsel for the Financial Regulatory Committee. "We appreciate your boss's passion today," the lobbyist says, swirling a glass of bourbon. "But let's be realistic about this proposal to break up our firm. If you force us to spin off our consulting arm, we lose 50% of our revenue. We will have to fire thousands of top-tier forensic accountants and tech specialists." The committee counsel frowns. "The public is demanding action after the Wirecard collapse. We have to do something structural." The lobbyist leans in closer, dropping the ultimate trump card. "If you cripple our network, who exactly is going to audit Apple? Who is going to audit Amazon or the Department of Defense? A mid-tier firm from Ohio? If we go down, the capital markets lose their certification entirely. Trading stops. The pension funds freeze. You cannot break us up because you cannot survive without us." The counsel stares into his drink, knowing the lobbyist is absolutely right. The Big Four have achieved the ultimate corporate defence mechanism. Too big to fail applied to the auditing profession. They have intertwined their own survival with the survival of global capitalism. The dialogue ends not with a threat of punishment, but with a quiet agreement to form another study group to look into minor procedural adjustments. The structural conflict of interest is officially designated as a permanent, untouchable feature of the market. This state of affairs is driven by a terrifying mechanism known as intellectual capture. The Big Four do not just dominate the market share of auditing, they dominate the very language of risk management. When a new financial regulation is passed, the government doesn't have the budget or the technical expertise to build the complex compliance frameworks required to enforce it. So, who does the government hire to design the risk matrices, the heat maps, and the standard templates? The Big Four. They are paid by the regulators to define what a good audit looks like. They effectively grade their own homework on a macroeconomic scale. This intellectual capture ensures that the solution to every audit failure is always exactly what the Big Four want: more standardised, box-ticking compliance, which requires companies to hire the Big Four for even more consulting hours to navigate the new rules. It is a perfectly closed loop. A massive fraud occurs. The public demands regulation. The Big Four help write the regulation. The regulation creates a massive new market for Big Four advisory services. They have successfully monetized their own failures. The alumni networks of these firms permeate the highest levels of corporate finance. Every CFO, every head of the SEC, every chief risk officer invariably spent a decade at Deloitte, PwC, EY, or KPMG. They all share the same blind spots, the same assumptions, and the same fundamental belief that the system, despite its massive, glaring flaws, is working exactly as intended. It is a monopoly not just of capital, but of thought. The shredders in Houston stopped running over 2 decades ago. Arthur Andersen is a ghost, a name invoked only as a historical warning. But the shadow monopoly that rose from its ashes is larger, more conflicted, and infinitely more powerful than the men who signed off on Enron could have ever imagined. The Big Four have successfully convinced the world that auditing is an objective science, while operating a business model that treats it as a loss leader for high-margin consulting. They have captured the regulators, normalized extreme switching costs, and insulated themselves from the fatal consequences of their own negligence. The system is entirely dependent on their stamp of approval, yet entirely incapable of holding them accountable when that stamp is used to validate a fraud. You have to realise that the fundamental architecture of the next massive market crash is already in place. Somewhere in a towering glass skyscraper right now, an exhausted junior auditor is staring at a highly suspicious spreadsheet provided by a massive corporate client. And somewhere in the partner's office down the hall, a multi-million-dollar consulting pitch is waiting to be signed. The choice between revealing the truth and protecting the revenue stream is being made at this exact second. The next Enron, the next Carillion, the next Wirecard is already out there, quietly operating with a pristine, fully certified clean bill of health from a Big Four firm. If you want to understand where the real risks are buried before the rest of the market finds out, hit subscribe, because the watchdogs aren't looking for the wolves anymore. They are too busy trying to sell them a new security system.